Hi, I am Dr. Michael Hudson Wood, and we are going to explore the student experience of a HyFlex model and ways that we can enhance it using the work of Dr. Brian Beatty. If you're interested in knowing more specifics about his work, the citation for where to find his work is located on this slide. So before we get too deep into the HyFlex model, there are three things to remember. First, strong classroom pedagogy is strong classroom pedagogy. Instead of thinking of this as a new way to teach, think of this as new tools to teach the way you already teach. The space has changed, but engagement has not. You will be amazed how much carryover you will have if you know how to use the tools correctly. So there is a great deal of fear from the unknown, but Belmont is an institution with fantastic teachers, and you will still be fantastic teachers. You will just use different tools to do it with. The second thing to remember is to share as much as possible. Share spaces, share activities, share conversations, share fears, share everything. We're going to get into what spaces means because no, I'm not a crazy person. And yes, I listen to science. But remember that when we don't address everybody's fear, it just becomes a piece of tension that never gets expressed and it keeps us from learning together. And the third thing to remember about HyFlex is it's not this or that, it's this with that. So instead of thinking of HyFlex as I have students in my class and I have students online, it's better to think I have online students with an in-class component. The more you think of this as an online class with certain tools that you can use on ground, the easier it's going to be for you to create a pedagogically sound sort of curriculum and activity base. Usually the thing to worry about when pedagogy is poor or classroom management is poor is that students won't learn or students won't be engaged. It's important to realize that a poorly managed HyFlex course can be alienating, overwhelming, and uninspiring. It goes far more than just what we're learning in a room, and it goes to how much of a part of a community we feel. And so it's really important to establish that community, and we'll get into how to do that. But just be aware that that's going to be an important part of this sort of new world that we're going into. So the first step in creating that classroom community and increasing a student's HyFlex experience is getting personal. There are so many ways to get personal in a course, and it really just depends on the level of where your students are and what you're comfortable in. So here you can see, usually the first thing I put on an online course is the syllabus. I want it front and center. I want them to know what I expect, all of my expectations. But in this HyFlex model, the first thing I want them to get to know is me. Why am I teaching this course? Why is this important to me? Now, this is a graduate level class, so there's not as much because I expect them to be able to navigate with a certain degree of competency. But it's just a video that I made of myself with my glasses. It's not that complicated. It's short, but it shows me excited. It shows me energized, and it lets them know that I'm ready to go. Now, for my freshman students, that looks a little bit different. So as you can see, there's no getting to know me in this, but there is a lot more material so that they can get to know the course because that's what they don't understand. You don't want to have everything in every class because it gets overwhelming. Now, where my students do get to know me is in the how-to video section. So instead of me saying, this is who I am, this is why this is important to me, they get pieces of my personality and videos that I've made that help them navigate the course. So again, they get pieces of me in the same way that my graduate students do, but it has a more directed focus. You can get personal however you want to get personal. Those are just two ways that I do it. You can also have a Q&A section where they can ask you anything on sort of like a Reddit thread. You can have social media. You can have whatever you like in your courses. I've seen teachers do like a flip book of pictures of themselves with little graphics as sort of a presentation. It's whatever you want. And I also encourage you to allow your students to get personal. Perhaps there's an assignment that's strictly getting to know each other, right? Where they have to present a picture or a word that they feel most encompasses who they are. The next thing to inspire your students is to focus on the possibilities rather than the limitations of this model. What can this realm offer that we can't normally have? So if you're anything like me, your friends are all over the country. They have so many interesting ways to do things. They do so many interesting things. And so usually I couldn't have my friends from North Carolina come and speak to my students about MLA or come speak to my students about creative writing in the same way that I would like to. But now I can, right? I can invite those people into my classrooms because they're already used to watching video, because they're already used to interacting that way. You can also do some pretty interesting things with small classes where if you know someone else's who's teaching a similar small classes, you can link those classes together online in a new way and have your students engage with students from all over the world. Instead of thinking of this as a limitation, I really want to encourage you to like, what can we do online that we can't do on ground, and incorporate those aspects into your class. The next thing you want to do is connect and create communities. You can do this by creating student showcases where it's a presentation on them rather than on content. You can move testing and quizzing time outside of instruction time, which frees up an incredible amount of time. As I am teaching this summer, I am realizing how much time I had to dedicate in my syllabus to just saying it's a 20-minute quiz. And I'm sure that there are some of you who have tests that take the entire class period. Imagine if you had 4 extra class days, because now those tests can be taken anytime. They don't have to be taken while you're together. What can you do with that time to connect and create community instead of just adding content? How can you open up your space? So the possibility for student sharing and student instruction really increases. Another element of this HyFlex model that really enhances the student experience is grace. We all know grace. We all need a little grace. The biggest thing that you can do to create grace in your online HyFlex classes is to create more assignments with lower stakes. Instead of 4 big assignments, perhaps 6 smaller assignments that allow your students to kind of become accustomed and fail a little bit and not completely ruin their averages. One of the things I like to do is I build extensions into my syllabus. Instead of you asking me, I have a blurb that basically says life happens. You get 1 3-day extension, no questions asked. You don't have to tell me why. You don't have to explain anything. Just send me an email the day before the activity, the paper, the quiz is due, and say I'm using my extension. So if you build that in, I have only ever had in 10 years of using this extension, 3 students use it. But it does take a lot of pressure off of students if they know that that grace is in there. And for me as an English teacher, I'm not going to be done grading in 3 days anyway. So if they turn it in and it's the last paper I grade, it's fine. Then there's extra credit, which I know is a dirty word to a lot of instructors, or dirty words to a lot of instructors. But extra credit allows your students to fail a little bit early on to get the hang of something and not necessarily ruin their grades. Extra credit also allows me to maintain rigor and expectations in my grading, right? So if I'm a little uncomfortable with the concept and I'm worried that maybe I'm not conveying it well enough in this HyFlex environment, and I'm looking at papers or students who aren't doing as well as I think they should, I can both grade in the way that says these aren't the answers I'm looking for, and know that I have provided cushion for both me and my students to improve their grades. Now, I'm not talking about extra credit because the student asked for it. I'm talking about extra credit that is built into the course. So we're back to my course now. And as you can see, extra credit is already built into the course. There's no asking, there's no begging at the end of the semester. When you haven't turned something in, it's there. These are the only opportunities you have. They don't go beyond this. And that also allows me to make them pretty specific to what I know students are going to fumble with. So to use them as a learning opportunity rather than just extra credit. So I have just a sheet of citations that they can correct for extra credit because that's a skill that they need to have. And it's not something that they can do over and over again in the class itself. I also have a find yourself in literature where they can choose a book to write a paper on, but they have to have some sort of in-group connection with either the protagonist or the author. This means that I don't have to make assumptions about who my students are to make sure that they're reading books that they see themselves in and find themselves in. So instead of thinking of extra credit as, ugh, it's gross, think of it as how can I add extra padding and extra learning into my class while still adding grace? The fourth way you can think of grace when doing a HyFlex model is to provide wiggle room within your assignments. So if you know that you're going to give 10 quizzes, perhaps just grade the best 8 or keep the highest 8 grades. Or if you are going to have 6 discussion boards, just do the best of 5. This allows them first to learn, right? Because maybe it's the first one that's horrible, but it also allows them to have a bad week, a confusing week, a week where they're not as sure as they could be. And then the final piece of grace is to change the way students contact you. So I have taken to giving students my phone number with boundaries that we will discuss for both my office and my cell phone. So just these extra elements of grace really make the class feel like there's some wiggle room, like the students have a voice and authority in the room. One of the things that's confusing about HyFlex is I wasn't exactly sure who is responsible for learning because a lot of the HyFlex models I was looking at made it seem like instructors were very responsible for learning, and that didn't seem true. So I like to think that instructors add a foundation so that students can take that responsibility on. So what is my role? My role is to provide enough access for students so that they can get the things that they need to get. Now, how do they do that? I have to scaffold that into the way that I teach. So students' responsibility to request clarity, that means it's my responsibility to be available. If a student's responsibility is time management, that means it's my responsibility to add as much information for what time management looks like in my course as possible. So for me, that means not only having a syllabus and the assignments, but also having weekly breakdowns that tell them what to expect each week so that they can kind of plan their week accordingly. Weekly breakdowns also allow me to give them supplementary materials that help and kind of edify what we're doing in class. There's also in my class a assignment checklist that has every single assignment and every single due date without all the rest of the stuff around it, without any syllabus around it, without any explanation. Here are your assignments and here's what I expect. So if my students are responsible for time management, I am responsible for giving them as much information for how to navigate that time as possible. The next issue is for my students to utilize resources. That's their responsibility. But how do I make that happen? It's my responsibility to make sure that they have access to as many resources as possible. So they have writing help, they have how-to videos. In another course that I teach, they also have access to things like student services. So you might want to add a student services tab where everything is just a link to student services that your students might need to use. Again, it's their responsibility to use them, but it's my responsibility as an instructor to provide some gateway or access for those things to happen. It is a student's responsibility to make sure that their internet and connection capability, both online and on ground, they need to be able to connect. They need to be able to get on the internet. That's their responsibility. One of the ways that I ensure that that stays constant is all students should be in the Zoom room or the Collaborate room at all times, even your on-ground students. This is really going to make some of your group work easier, and we'll talk more about that later. And finally, it's their responsibility to manage their health and physical and mental well-being. My responsibility to increase student experience is to decentralize learning, which means that I need to allow my students some space to give me what they need, to show me how the class is going to work for them, because I've never had the experience of being a HyFlex student. So I have to respond and listen to that sort of decentralized learning. Again, so many people have already decentralized their classrooms. It's just doing it in a different way. It's my job to focus on goals rather than explicit direction following. So once upon a time, I always required a research paper. Now I require a research project that allows my students the freedom to do everything that they want to do and express themselves in the way that they feel is best. But it still understands the goals of what a research paper does, which is, can you incorporate knowledge? It requires an annotated bibliography so that I know they can access and sort of evaluate sources. I know they can summarize. I know they understand how to paraphrase and how to cite and all of those things. It's my responsibility to communicate. You do that online, but you can also do it with like weekly update emails that talk about your expectations. You can do it in class just by saying, you know what, time out, I messed that up. Let me rewind, right? Just being very honest about what's happening in your class so that students know she messed up, he messed up, I can mess up. It's important to set boundaries. And when we are adding online components to our class, it increases student access to us. So it's important that within your syllabus, you set boundaries. Yes, you can call me. Yes, you can text me, but you have to do it before 8 o'clock. You cannot do it on Sundays. You cannot do it on Wednesday evenings when I'm at church with my family. So all of those boundaries are set very clearly, very early on. So yes, they have access to me in a new way, but no, they cannot invade my life because I have to worry about my physical and mental health as well. And also there's feedback, right? There's an amazing amount of power in the question of, am I talking too much in a HyFlex environment? What do you need from me? What can I do differently? Maybe a week or two into class, just have a moment where you can set up an anonymous discussion board where students can give you feedback or simply ask the question. Students are craving community right now. So how do you create a classroom community? You can do it with peer review. You can do it with group work. There's a lot of ways to do group work in this sort of realm. One of the things I learned how to do this summer that I think is really neat is to create collaborate rooms that are always open for students. So for me, I call them study rooms. And as you can see, my office is also a collaborate room that's always open, but it allows students without having to do group me or social media or give each other a phone number to say, hey, meet me in study room 2 at 4 o'clock. So as long as they all have access to your course, they can click on the study room they want to go into at any time. I also do things like have a communal whiteboard where we're all working together. So instead of a whiteboard where we would all be looking at the same thing, it's just a Google document that we all can write on, right? So I have opened it up. They can edit it. They can write on it. They can circle things. They can highlight it. But we're all doing it together instead of me being in class using the whiteboard. Again, remember to think of this as an online space with an on-ground component rather than the other way around, right? So I want my whiteboard to be online so that we can all look at it, but some of us are talking about it face to face. Again, thinking about opening feedback and informal reflections, and then discussions are a really important part of creating a classroom community. And you want those discussions to be both synchronous, where you're having the conversation as class goes on, and asynchronous, where you're using perhaps a discussion board or some element like that. So what's a HyFlex discussion look like? I like to start with an overnight prompt so they know what we're going to talk about in the beginning. Sometime that prompt overlaps with the discussion board so they can kind of get on a soapbox on the formal discussion board, and I'll pick pieces I like, or instead of having them respond to each other in the discussion board, have them respond to each other in person the next day. And then there's reflections. Now, Beatty suggests to use both formal and informal discussion boards as sort of a combination of things. I find that students get confused if some of the things that use this tool are formal and other things that use this tool are informal. That's somewhat confusing and discombobulating. So I would suggest asking them to keep a Google Drive journal that they can then send you a link to so that you can review, or to create an overwhelming project. But since we're using Beatty's work here, and he does say that he likes to use informal discussion boards as a way of reflection and asking for feedback. It doesn't work for me, but it works for him, and you can decide to do it however you want to do it. You can have a Dropbox for a journal. You can make the journal sort of an essay quiz kind of thing. But I would suggest, if you use the tool, to try to use that tool one way, to not confuse your students too much. Finally, you want to create spaces. This is what I meant by creating online spaces, right? So I showed you the study rooms. The study rooms are really key. The students really like them because they're always available, and they do make planning to meet very easy. You can do group chats. You can have social media pages that are specific to your students. It's really up to you, but you need to create spaces that all of your students can go to. Again, thinking of it as an online course with an on-ground component, so that your on-ground students are going into these online spaces rather than you trying to kind of piecemeal an on-ground-ish space for your online students. Just create spaces online for them to be. And finally, Beatty has these 10 tips for students. I did not read this until after I had already started teaching, but I am going to make a video of me sort of doing my version of these 10 tips for students. Like, hi, I'm Michael. Here's some tips for surviving. So it's take advantage of the new model. Don't fight against it. Read the syllabus, which seems pie in the sky, as students rarely read the syllabus, but it is nice to at least say it out loud. Take charge of your learning. Students are going to have to be accountable in a new way that they're not used to necessarily. Get to know your classmates. Again, we want to encourage a classroom community, but at the end of the day, it's on students to create communities for themselves as well. So send them to spaces together, create activities where they can speak, but also encourage them to exchange numbers or contact information, or use those study rooms so that they can get to know each other. Reflect on your experiences so that you can offer feedback to your instructors. Attend class. And when I say attend class for my online students, I say attend class means that you are focused, paying attention, not in your pajamas, and sitting up. So define what attend class looks like to you. If students are laying down, they're going to fall asleep. We know that. They don't think that. Diversify your environment. You can be wherever feels good for you to be as a student, right? So some of my students sit outside. Some of my students sit at a desk. Some of my students, I can tell they're on the couch that they love. They've got their cat there. Diversify your environment. Do something different. Communicate with your instructor, communicate with each other. It's incredibly important. Be available and dependable through all methods of delivery. Beatty actually says, don't be a flake, as his tip. But if we're going to try to create these experiences for you as instructors, it's your responsibility as a student to be dependable, to be there. And then the final tip that Beatty has is to have fun. I'm not really sure what that means. You can make that mean whatever you want. And that's pretty much it. Again, we are already creating spaces for our students. We are already creating conversations for our students. It's just with a HyFlex model, you have to think of the student experience as something you have to scaffold and create, rather than something that happens necessarily organically because of the way humans work as social creatures when we're in the same space. So I hope this has been helpful.